You may be surprised by how often you'll find yourself having to sew a corner seam in the dressmaking process. Luckily, sewing corners is fairly simple and can be quite fun, especially when you get the satisfaction of a good end result. Here are the 3 different types of corner seams and best practices for sewing them. Align the 2 layers of fabric on top of each other with face-side stitching and the corners aligning. Insert pins or hand bastes to keep the fabric layers in place. Starting along the vertical edge, begin stitching at the designated seam allowance, moving down towards the corner. If your sewing machine does not provide crossing guidelines, add a piece of masking tape from the needle point down to the same distance as the seam allowance. When the fabric's bottom horizontal edge aligns with the designated cross line, lift the presser foot, leaving the sewing machine needle in, and pivot the fabric such that the horizontal fabric edge is now oriented vertically and aligning with the appropriate seam allowance guides. Drop the presser foot and continue stitching. A technique called blunting is used when stitching the corner area. Blunting a corner means that instead of a sharp transition from the vertical to the horizontal stitch, 1 to 3 stitches are added diagonally at the corner while shifting direction. The amount of stitches needed for blunting is based on fabric thickness. Lightweight fabrics only need a single diagonal stitch. Medium weight fabrics will often need 2 diagonal stitches, while heavy, bulky fabrics may require 3 or more blunting stitches. This subtle diagonal stitch allows room for the enclosed seam allowance to sit in a position that forms a flatter, sharper corner. Additional to blunting, the seam allowance requires to be trimmed diagonally in order to eliminate overlapping bulk. Just like sewing outward corners, inward corners require the same type of pivoting action in the stitching process. The only difference is the direction of the pivot. Blunting is not needed on inward corners. To facilitate the stitching process, start by marking the corner seam lines. These marked seam lines will provide an important guide when pivoting the corner stitch. To mark the lines, you can use tailor's chalk and a ruler or gauge pointer. Align the matching inner corner edges with the fabric face-sides touching and insert pins perpendicular to the edge to keep fabric layers together. Begin stitching the vertical seam line following the marked chalk line as a guide. When arriving at the corner, insert the machine needle through the corner point. Lift the presser foot and pivot the fabric layers in the direction of the horizontal seam line. Drop the presser foot and continue stitching. The end result should be a perfect corner stitch with a well-defined point. To reinforce the corner area, change your machine setting to a shorter stitch and stitch over the corner, extending about 1 inch on each side. At this point, if you attempt to turn the corner seam on its face side, you'll find that this is nearly impossible due to the seam allowance tension created at the corner. For that reason, it is imperative that the seam allowance is notched diagonally. Clip the seam allowance from the edge up to the corner point, being very careful not to clip through the actual stitching. This will release tension in the inner corner seam and allow you to iron it flat as required in your final application. Similar to sewing opposite curved edges, sewing an inner corner to an outer one requires some clipping before the final seam is aligned, pinned, and stitched. Using tailor's chalk and a ruler, start by marking the seam lines on the wrong side of the inner corner edge. Apply a machine stitch extending about 1 inch on each side of the corner point, as shown. The marked seam lines will provide a guideline for applying the stitch perfectly. This stitch will serve as a stabilizing stay stitch and is only needed along the inner corner edge. Clip the inner corner seam allowance diagonally up to the stitched corner. Clip very close to the corner, but be careful not to accidentally clip the stitching. Next, place the inner corner edge on top of the outer corner edge with fabric face sides touching. Align and pin the corresponding vertical edges up to the clipped corner point. Spread the clipped edge such that the horizontal fabric edges align and insert pins to keep the layers in this position. Stitch the vertical edge following the marked seam lines and seam allowance guides on your sewing machine. Stitch until you arrive at the corner point. Insert the machine needle at this point and leaving the needle inserted, lift the presser foot and shift the fabric layers such that the horizontal edge is now aligned with the machine seam allowance guides. Drop the presser foot and continue stitching the seam. Last but not least, clip any additional excess from the corner seam before turning it on its face side and finally ironing it to complete.